And now we've got Robert from TfL. He's going to talk to us about streamlining the reporting of ridership figures with R and talk to us a little bit about how they've approached some of the more challenging tasks during COVID-19, as I'm sure we can all appreciate. So Robert, I think you're already off mute. I'll invite you to share your screen. I shall stop sharing again. And again, just as before, please do keep yourselves on mute, guys. If you've got any questions, post them in the chat and we'll put them to Robert afterwards. And I shall let Robert take the stage.
Great. Hopefully you can see my blue screen. Perfect. Right, so streamlining the reporting of ridership figures with the help of R. So that's what I'll be talking about for the next 20 minutes or so. So first of all, Transport for London. A very quick summary, a fleeting overview of the services that Transport for London is responsible for. So TfL, I hope you all agree, is an iconic brand with the modes of London Underground or the Tube, and the bus being very much part of the fabric of London. Anyone who's visited London, even just the once, would have likely have travelled on a TfL mode of transport. TfL is also responsible for the DLR, London Overground, TfL Rail and Tram. It also manages the congestion charge, the road maintenance of many London roads, traffic signals, and 580 kilometres of roads in London are TfL's responsibility. So on top of that, we also do a lot of sponsor services. Responsible for those are the Emirates Airline, to the cable car, which goes from one half of the Royal Docks to the other, Santander Cycle Hire, and the Thames Clipper Riverboat services, as well as Dial-A-Ride. So it's a very varied offering that TfL provides. But this talk is about ridership figures. So we'll be focusing here on the two largest modes, which are Tube, or the Underground, and bus. And that's the focus from here on in. So let's get straight to it. How has London's transport network and ridership figures in particular been impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic? So we capture transactional data of the use of contactless payment cards and Oyster payment cards on our network, and we can summarize and split out activity by bus, which is the red line on the screen in front of you, and Tube, which is the blue line. So we've got the number of journeys in millions on the y-axis and the date since middle of January on the x-axis. So we've got a time series here of what's happened this year. And we can see from around the second week of March onwards, demand has fallen dramatically to kind of unprecedented lows as we were in lockdown itself. Demand on the Tube on Easter Sunday was actually the lowest on record for over a century, at around 5% of normal demand, which is the same day last year comparator. So we stopped collecting customer taps on buses in the middle of May, June, as we encourage passengers to board through the middle door. So that explains why the red line bottomed out. You can kind of envisage where it would have gone. Since June, as various restrictions have eased, demand has slowly been rising until late October. So bus was around 60% of normal demand and Tube just shy of 40%. However, since we've been back in the tiers and lockdown 2.0, demand has dropped yet again. But as of yesterday, we've seen a return of demand to the network to similar levels as it was in October, but not quite yet. As you can see, the bus is more resilient than the Tube in terms of recovery. And this is just an example where the lockdown periods are. The kind of reddish kind of shading is where the first lockdown and the second lockdown occurred. So where does R come in exactly? Well, here's the background. Well, ridership figures income is something that we periodically report anyway in the public domain. Information exists in many databases of demand at a much finer level. And there's opportunities for individuals within TfL to self-serve using various business intelligence softwares if they're lucky enough to have a login and know the way around particular softwares. But there's nothing similar of note for interested external parties. So with the extra scrutiny on ridership figures, it was necessary to start a process to report passenger numbers in a much more convenient way for all parties. And this was around very early March that the need arose. Often this would include an appreciation of what's happening on the very same day. We simply couldn't wait until the end of the day for the data to be summarized on our behalf. So this data would, of course, be invaluable for short-term planning. Our transport planning teams that are used to planning 10, 20 years into the future, that got turned on its head overnight, and they were planning months ahead, weeks ahead, even days ahead. So a very quick mention about the audience of these ridership figures. So they're going to be people like directors within TfL, various government departments, Department for Transport, Mayor's Office, a lot of boroughs that are interested in these figures for their particular region, the police, and of utmost importance was for these people to read the ridership report and grab headlines and the latest figures and trends almost at a glance in a very digestible manner. So the majority of these individuals on this list, time was of the essence. Simply, at present anyway, wouldn't have the time to click on a URL or to navigate into a dashboard of some sort. The reality of it is that on average, the time spent looking at a ridership report is probably going to be around a minute or less. And at the moment, the medium in which these were previously delivered was email, and that's still the same at present. So what our task was to make this process as streamlined and as slick as possible. So yeah, that's a little touch on the audience there. But we did have something there that we could recycle. So this was how things used to happen. There's a long-standing report in the area which I now work, which was there well before I walked through the door. However, it was primarily used just a few times a year. It was called a strike report. It acknowledged it wasn't ideal, but at the same time, since it was just about bearable, the process had stayed static, and it was difficult to justify taking resource of other projects to change it. Obviously, all that changed fairly quickly, but just for information, we had 8 SQL queries which ran against 2 separate databases. There was a lot of copy and pasting of the results into Excel, pivoting, and copy and pasting into Excel to disseminate. Obviously, there's a huge amount of room for improvement there. QAs are also almost as important as running the report itself. And with more human interaction, you're likely to make some mistakes. However, this is now, so since March, early March, this has now been the process which we're very happy to report on. And as I'd imagine, this is what most of you came here to learn more about. So we've got the hex logos on the left-hand side, so ggplot2 and dplyr. So these are the stable R packages from the tidyverse, which are even more popular than ever at the moment. And we'll talk more about R Markdown and HTTR a bit later. But there's a reason why Jupyter is sitting in the middle. It's really the engine behind this whole process, absolutely fundamental, in fact. So Jupyter's a fairly interesting one, heavily associated with Python, but as the name suggests, also caters for Julia and also the R language as well. And it's a spin-off from IPython, which was developed in, spun off from IPython in 2014. The idea is that you would edit and run code in the web browser via an interactive notebook. And the idea behind the notebook is you can create and importantly share your notebook with others to explore, either the output cells or to actually run the code themselves. So for those unfamiliar, I thought it'd be useful just to show a few slides on Jupyter Notebook itself. There is a warning to any R users that you'll likely have to download Anaconda and have this downloaded just to access all the goodness of Jupyter. So there's 2 more packages, which I'll mention again later. SF package, which kind of goes hand in hand with ggplot2 for our one of our main outputs, and to help with the email automation, Microsoft Graph API. But I'll come on to that a bit later. So here's Jupyter. When you start a new Jupyter notebook, this is what you'll be greeted with. You can simply start typing exactly how you would in an R script, but inside a cell. So these little blocked out windows at the top of each notebook are called cells. To execute that cell, you'll be very happy to learn that Control and Enter works perfectly fine. So we can start typing in any syntax that you're familiar with for R, so library dplyr, library ggplot2. However, you'll probably need some luck finding the Object Explorer. There isn't one, but that's something you need to get quickly used to, and it's not too troublesome after a while. So you can execute things as normal, insert cells using the menu above. It's probably a keyboard shortcut as well that can help there. And yeah, having inserted a cell, we've now got another blank cell which we can then populate with more R syntax. So this is just sample syntax, all of which will work perfectly fine if the files or database credentials are all set up properly. And finally, this is what was particularly useful, is that we can take advantage of some user input. So this can be used to kind of parameterize the rest of this script. So for your information, not everyone in the team I'm in is familiar with R, but they are very confident when running the notebooks, and have even been known to debug notebooks when something might have gone wrong. This deserves its own slide, the R kernel. So the kernel is essentially a connection file, but acquiring the R kernel is definitely easier than it looks. But here are some links to help guarantee you'll see R in the drop-down menu. So we hopefully wouldn't have to go through the same problem that we've gone through, but it's not as easy as it looks. So one for your own time just to browse over that, I think. And here are some of the sample outputs of the notebook. So we have a few notebooks that we've set up to run ridership reports, and they're well maintained. One of which is the daily report, which looks back to yesterday to report on a full day's worth of ridership figures. And this is something we generally deliver around 9 AM most days. What we're seeing and have seen over the last 6 months is Monday generally sets the trend for the week. But we have been known to report daily on these figures, particularly instances like this week, where lockdown has lifted exactly in the middle of the week. So it takes as input a baseline date and the day in question, which in this instance is the 12th of October. And having slowly stepped through around 12, 13 cells of the notebook, you'll get the following output saved out. So a text file, which summarizes the headline for the day. We also get a PNG file, which is a trend graph, which gets updated. This is year-on-year comparisons, and ggplot plus patchwork. Library patchwork is a really good package for integrating ggplots on top of each other. So we've got a year-on-year appreciation and a week-on-week appreciation for bus and tube. And we also have a table here, which is saved out as a CSV file. And this is of particular interest that we categorize 270 of our tube stations, that's all of them, into station types. So inner and outer suburb, as you can see, is recovering quicker than the city stations. So this is just a nice KPI to kind of keep track of as well. And then there's other attachments which get saved out as CSV as well, which make their way into the email. But at this point in time, we were still maintaining and compiling the email off our own back. However, with thanks to those two packages we mentioned before, or HTTR and the Microsoft Graph API, as well as R Markdown, our outputs are now HTML format, which means that we can embed the ridership report directly into an email and even get the email to send. However, we would only send it to a shared mailbox for QA. We wouldn't send it to everyone on our recipient list unless it's been formally checked. So yeah, HTTR and MS Graph API, the combination of those two effectively allows us to attach HTML to the body of the email and send that via the Microsoft Office 365 into a mailbox of our liking. We've also attached files to these emails as well. It's not evident in this screen print here, but we can also automate the attachments which follow around the headline and the graph itself. So it's fairly nice looking and it's standardized. And we do get this sent over, as mentioned earlier, to our shared mailbox. And we'd only ever send it once it's passed a formal QA. But there are further enhancements, as well as providing this standard report, which always existed, and adding certain elements, such as the graph. We can make things maybe jump out the page a little bit more. So there's different flavors of report that are now available. So as well as automating that process, which you talked about, there's also ad hoc reports, which we set up from time to time. So we use the SF and ggplot package showcase predominantly here. And again, Jupyter Notebook features, so we can input parameters such as day, baseline day, the day in question, what hour of the day interested, a certain period from and to, and the Jupyter Notebook facilitates the writing of outputs and the compilation of the email. Again, we'll still QA before we send anywhere, but this process of these additional ad hoc reports is just down to a few minutes now. So here's one example of a bus hotspot report. So this is actually information from yesterday. So yesterday, lockdown was lifted in England. And as you can see, this is the interpeak period between 10 and 1 p.m. And just at a glance, we can see where the changes have been compared to the same day last week. So last Wednesday compared to yesterday. And it's fairly obvious there's more increased usage in central London and various suburbs. But it kind of just jumps out the page. And these are really have gone down very well. We also have a similar one for tube hotspots. You can't really have a presentation from someone from TfL without the tube map. So there's my slide. Again, we've got a similar story. This is yesterday up to 10 a.m. This is ggplot currently with a background image. There's probably better ways to do this. But we've got a Harry Beck tube map. And we can clearly see here that yesterday signaled a return to shopping districts. So Bond Street, Oxford Circus, Tottenham Court Road, very, very popular compared to the same day last week. So the benefits of automation. So I've had to put an R chunk in, so errors, null. That's the aim really, but obviously one of the main benefits of automation is that any previously human element is being eliminated. So yeah, we've now got fairly standardized code, it's fairly rigorously checked, which we're very confident in. But we still like to check it before it comes out, mainly because we may have some data latency problems. There's certain stations, if there's a problem with the power around the station, may not submit their transactional taps on time. So we would always do some element of QA. But yeah, this is the biggest thing really for us, that through automation, we've been able to free our time to do more critical activities. So the first example I've got here is identifying which parts of London were still showing signs of high travel on our services at the very beginning of lockdown. And we were able to identify areas of London to get critical comms out, where the reduction of travel was not at the rate that we were expecting. So the various areas of East London, North East London, where we would not see the reduction as compared to the rest of London. And these posters were placed in stations in many different languages, sometimes on the same day in which we performed our analysis, to really highlight the seriousness of the stay home message. Next example is looking at pseudonymized transactional data, which is restricted to our small team, just to identify typical travel patterns of key workers. So you'll see a picture here of Belsize Park Station, which is usually ranked about 200 and something of our busiest stations. And all of a sudden we found it in our top 10. And the reason being is that we got the Royal Free Hospital next to it. So Belsize Park's got about 4 gates and it's a lift only station. But the reason why is because key workers were using that station. So we were able to identify the kind of travel patterns expected of key workers, such as shift work, 12-hour shifts generally for nurses, doctors, for example, 7-hour shifts, And we were finding stations where the pattern was not similar to key workers, which highlighted that construction activity was still taking place, as well as maybe shorter activity trips. So Stratford Station, there was obviously people still, even though most of the shops were closed there was still activity there, which suggested people were not working, but were actually doing non-essential travel. So police were there at Stratford the next day to question passengers for their reasons for travel based on our analysis. And finally, the returns to schools planning. There was an extraordinary amount of planning in September for the return to schools period, promoting active travel and additional services on routes that serve schools, and operating every other bus as school bus only buses on certain routes as well. So we had some time due to automation to contribute to that planning process. And again, we were able to monitor using Jupyter notebooks by looking at certain card types, which are called zip cards in London. So almost a similar report, but just dedicated towards zip cards. So Jupyter notebook was easily modifiable just to have a unique report for maybe 3-4 weeks just dedicated to zip cards. And finally, let's move on to R Markdown for storytelling. Within the last 6-7 months or so, we have found some fairly interesting insights that we thought it would be very important to share with the business. And we look to do this in an engaging way. So we utilize the Flex dashboard package, particularly the storyboard feature, to disseminate insight in an engaging way. This also helps promote the team. I'm going to show you an example of a publication we sent to the whole company, which is hosted on our local intranet site. But this was around the easing of lockdown on the 4th of July this year, where restaurants and the hospitality industry were allowed to reopen. There's a package which I'll highlight called BS Select R. Just to highlight, BS is Bootstrap, HTML widgets as well. You may have seen Diagraph being featured on the second slide of this talk as well. And we've now up to full volumes in total, and it's been described as a little bit GIF heavy in places, but let's find out. So yeah, first of all, if you are new to Markdown, this is how you access Markdown. So File, R Markdown. Following that, having installed Flex dashboard, the template should appear in this menu here. And then at the very top of the page, you'll get this option to set storyboard to true. This is the YML header, which is basically a config section. And then the rest is, perhaps you can have a session on Markdown by yourself another time, but 3 little backwards ticks here is a dedicated R chunk, where we're going to bring in all the libraries. And then each Markdown template has got its own kind of flavor. And for Flex Dashboard, the free hashes highlighted a new section. The 3 dots or stars highlighted the commentary. And yeah, we've got an R chunk in the middle, which calls in Bootstrap carousel and free images, but we'll show you that now. So here's an example of our publication, which was shared. So we've got that standard kind of holding page, which is passenger numbers, but we've also got this kind of carousel now, which is all the kind of station types, just highlighted what's actually happened over the last maybe 4 Saturdays. And people can step through that in their own time. They got some commentary on the right, which they can browse. It's really an engaging way to just to highlight what's actually happened. We can also choose different stations. So these are the ranked in terms of the biggest increase as a consequence of the ease in restrictions. So Leicester Square saw a 306% increase week on week. But interestingly, Richmond, which is a leafy suburb of London, was the next highest, which is 127%, as people made their way and enjoyed the sunny weather to the leafier districts and parks of London. And here's one final example of a GIF or GIF, whatever takes your fancy, of the GG Animate package. So again, this kind of brings to life and engages the audience. So there are more tabs, but I think I'll move on now. So in conclusion, automation, and this is the kind of famous kind of phrase that gets chucked around. If you do something 3 times, write a function for it. And we've done exactly that here. We've automated a report which previously was quite cumbersome, and we're very happy with the results. Jupyter Notebooks to the rescue. People are still running the report, maybe not familiar with R, but they still feel in control, and they can step through. The process now ends in email generation, and to get to that stage, it was kind of an iterative process of improvements bit by bit. We've kept the business kind of and beyond TfL, government agencies, as described earlier, informed since March of demand levels, trends, and interesting customer behavioral insight in a consistent, timely, and engaging manner. And the next steps are we need to productionize the entire suite of outputs with a development team. But we would still need, so effectively we built a prototype, we would still need our QA checks to be effectively unit tests, etc. Any drift analysis alerts that we would know to look out for to be coded up efficiently. And we do need to think about our audience as well, and maybe could we do anything to encourage our users to access this information in a more self-serve fashion. So perhaps maybe user interviews, just understanding what is maybe the blockers to encouraging them to do something another way. But at the same time, email is a very convenient and a comfort blanket for many people. The last conclusion is that we're always learning, always room for improvement. In the same way we picked up the process that we've enhanced as data scientists a bit further down the line, an extra few pairs of eyes will no doubt make things even better. Some final points. We have released a Microsoft Power BI, which helped to relieve the pressure significantly on requests for specific ridership figures. So on this part of the TfL website, if you click on this button here, you'll get taken to a Power BI web page, which is being established, published externally. So this is effectively the same chart I showed at the very beginning with the network trends. And this is all in the public domain. Importantly, on page 3, so that's exactly the same data as I showed. Importantly, on page 3, there's an appreciation at station level as well. And I'm going to ask a question which someone in the chat might be able to answer. But if I'm going to choose Arsenal Station, and you get it filtered down based on the station in question. So this is all kind of available in the public domain, but we've got 5 spikes at fairly random points up to the beginning of March. So maybe someone in the chat can tell me what happened at Arsenal Station on these days. Okay, almost done. A few useful links, Jupyter Notebooks, and this actually presentation was produced using Markdown. Yeah, a little bit of a shout out to a colleague of mine, Alex Drake, inspired by the BB plot package. There's actually a TfL, an official TfL plot. We've also got an internal transport for Lundown, which is an R Markdown template. So yeah, full credit to Alex Drake. And yeah, thanks. Hopefully you've all got something out of that, found that useful, inspired you to go on to investigate Jupyter or Markdown, or go on a journey with those 2 particular packages or softwares. But yeah, many thanks to the Brighton R team, Jeremy for asking me to present, and Silicon Brighton for their continued sponsorship. So thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Robert. And I've seen quite a few clapping icons come through and a few people clapping their hands too. I think that was fantastic. I mean, from my perspective, the two things that I love the most in life, I should say this really quietly because I'm sitting at home with my wife and son outside, but the two things that I love the most are R and trains. So basically, this is my ideal presentation to watch. So it was a fantastic talk. Also seeing some of the figures, I mean, it's just so relevant to see exactly what's going on in London at the moment. There has been a bit of debate on the chat about the buses versus the tubes, why the buses kind of pick up quicker than the tubes pick up, and as to whether that's because people feel more comfortable going on buses perhaps at the moment. Do you have a take on that, TFL?
So yeah, that could be one reason, but generally buses cover the outer perimeter of London, so the inner and outer suburbs where we're seeing more people. Buses are more prevalent in those areas, so yeah, the commuters aren't coming to London at the moment as much as they used to. So the tube was the kind of commuter haven, whereas the buses are more in tune with Londoners as a whole, particularly in the suburb areas, and also used by school children as well. So they count for a fair proportion of that.
It's interesting. I went to London for a meeting just before lockdown, and it just felt like a ghost town. It didn't feel like London at all. It's very odd kind of coming off the train.
Yeah, and that's the city station type highlights that fairly well. Yeah, stations like Bank, which are usually carrying over 100,000 people per day, are carrying nowhere near that at the moment. 15,000, 16,000 maybe.
And there were some questions about the dips on your chart. Were they Sundays, those dips?
Yeah, so on the first page, is that right?
Yeah.
That would be Sundays. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, you could maybe smooth that to make it a bit neater.
No, I think it's really good to see kind of the figures in the raw and see exactly
Sunday 25th. Yeah.
Fascinating chart. There was a question from Dean, which I think everybody's tried to have a go at answering, and it was about the integrating the MS Graph API with HTTR as well. And I'm not even sure if that's been answered yet, but I think Dean wanted to know a little bit more about how you did that.
So there's a package called Azure Auth. So we've only really investigated Microsoft API recently, but it effectively allows you to access your whole Microsoft estate in one place. So you can upload files to SharePoint, take things down from SharePoint, and also just send emails. So yeah, if anyone wants to Google Microsoft Graph API, and if you're part of Office 365 at the moment, then there's some parallel kind of options available.
Fantastic. If there's any other questions from anybody, please put them into the chat now. If I have forgotten your question, please put it into the chat again. I've tried to pick the questions from the banter out in there.
Sorry, Jeremy, can I ask a question? It'll take me too long to type. Okay, Rob, thank you very much for it. Learned a lot from this. So I have actually a two-part question. And the first one is I didn't quite get, so when you were talking about use of R Markdown, I didn't quite get what Jupyter notebooks. I'm a Python user and an R user, so I'm very familiar and fond of Jupyter. But still, I wonder what has Jupyter offered that R Markdown did not?
So one of the reasons that not everyone's at the same level of our kind of prowess in our team. So we kind of we're able to hand over the notebook to people who didn't necessarily know R as well as other people. And they wanted to have some sort of control. So Jupyter gave us that element of able to typing, the date in question, when's the report for 7 till 10, etc. So it was there as a medium to facilitate the report. So yeah, by sharing the notebook with others who could just step through it, that was the aim there. But yeah, Markdown itself, just from start to finish, could have done the same thing. And yeah, we're kind of at that stage now where we we use the outputs from the Jupyter notebook, but kind of knitted together using R Markdown. So it's kind of a bit back to front.
I have a follow-up, if I may. Did David's talk earlier tempt you at all when in moving from Power BI to Shiny?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Shiny fan. I mean, to public that Power BI dashboard was just one click, and all of a sudden, a deadline, which was a few days away, was met in an hour. So it does allow you to kind of publish things in a button click. But yeah, Power BI is, has got an R element. It plays fairly nicely with R. But yeah, hosting Shiny is always a bit of a problem as well. The data engineers and TFL would need to do a bit of work for us. So Power BI at the moment in the external facing publication was the choice. Yeah.
Excellent. I think Oscar's had all of his questions answered. He gave a big thumbs up. We've got one more question on the chat from Jospin as well. So was the data, or was their data received on the average journey length, and did that change drastically?
Yeah, so I've got a slide on that, which isn't here, unfortunately. But yeah, the journey length went down on average. Yeah, we got a nice kind of distribution, which we put on top of each other before and after lockdown. People are generally traveling shorter distances. Yeah.
Fantastic. Right. Well, that's all the questions that we've got. But ever since I saw you talk at must have been a year or over a year ago now, Robert, I've wanted to get you here talking at Brighton R. Selfishly because of my love of trains and R, but I'm glad that we finally managed to make it work. And I'm sure everyone will agree that was really interesting and insightful and topical, and learning a lot about the way that London's worked and coped with COVID from a transport perspective. So thank you so much for joining us again. And yeah, we'll definitely be seeing you again at Brighton, I'm sure.
Great pleasure. Thank you.